Oh, I am very glad to be here tonight. So hello, I'm Chuck Raison. I am indeed the director of BHIC, or Behavioral Health Innovation Center. And so what we're trying to do is to do rigorous studies of new ways of treating mental illness, behavioral disorders, depression, anxiety, substance use, these sorts of things. And I don't need to tell you probably that there is a huge need for this, especially among young people. Rates of suicide, depression, skyrocketing. Thank God we have the treatments we have. They help a percentage of people, but they don't do the full thing. There's a huge open sky of possibility, and we're trying to step into that sky by looking at several, sort of novel ways of treating things like depression and anxiety. So, you'd think tonight would be a talk about depression and anxiety. Why are we hosting a talk about consciousness? But if you think about it for a second, if you think about things, let's just take depression, which is something that we really focus on. Why is depression a problem? The main reason depression is a problem is because it tortures consciousness. If you've ever been depressed, you know what I'm talking about. You go round and around, and the internal conscious space of your mind and heart is a hell. It's horrible, right? And so when we think about, if I'm a psychiatrist, and if you come to see me and I write out a script, and you take an SSRI or something like that, if it works for you, you take it every day, and 10, 11, 12 days later, you wake up and you go, oh, the sky's blue. I don't feel as bad. And then you begin to feel better, right? What's happened? Some kind of biochemical thing has changed what your consciousness feels like. And in standard psychiatry, and this has been the case for at least 50, 60 years now, this is how we've looked at things, which is really, we're just giving you pills to try to change your consciousness. But at BHIC, we've turned the tables on that, and we are looking at treatments. A primary focus is looking at treatments that help people by using consciousness itself as the means of transformation. And particularly the types of experiences that can be induced by psychedelics when they're delivered in a very clinically responsible way, these transformative things in consciousness where people have experiences that they're never the same afterwards. They've seen and understood something about themselves and their place in the universe that makes them see life in a way that changes their consciousness in a way that makes it, more joyful, more active, more open. So tonight's talk about consciousness could not be more directly relevant to this very, I think, frankly, amazing work that we're doing here, looking and trying to help people with depression by modulating consciousness, treatments that actually impact consciousness. So there's a deep, deep connection, and in fact, our speaker tonight, Dr. Koch, and his colleague, Giulio Tononi, some of the work they've done is foundational for some of the work that we're doing, not just here actually, but at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Okay, so it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Christof Koch. We are really honored to have him. I think arguably he's one of the most influential neuroscientists in the world. He was willing and did in fact engage around questions of trying to scientifically study consciousness when it was a dangerous thing in the scientific world to do so. Most neuroscientists, especially 20 years ago, 30, 40 years ago, didn't really think consciousness existed, or they thought it didn't really do anything. And so Christof did just groundbreaking work with a guy named Francis Crick. Remember Watson and Crick, who discovered DNA? Right. And so from that, he held a long-term, amazingly productive career at Caltech, and then was recruited by Paul Allen, less famous kind of guy that co-created Microsoft, and took over this astounding new brain institute called the Allen Brain Institute. I've been inside it. It's giant. It's the size of Vail Hospital. And he ran that, and then was tapped to direct a fascinating nonprofit foundation that is in fact supporting some of our work through our colleagues at Emory University called the Tiny Blue Dot Foundation, which is funded by a lovely woman named Elizabeth Koch. So, we're going to hear about consciousness tonight, and I'll say one final thing about Dr. Koch. He's climbed up El Capitan. You guys know El Capitan? Yeah. So, it's hard to beat, right? So anyway, Christof, it's all yours.
Within seconds, my entire field of view became engulfed by dark, swirling smoke. The space around me fractured into 1,000 hexagons and shattered. The speed which this happened left no time to regret the situation I'd got myself into. As I was sucked into a black hole, my last thought was that with the dying of the light, I too would die, and I did. I ceased to exist in any recognizable way, shape, or form. No more Christof, no more ego, no more self, no memories, dreams, desires, hopes, fears. Everything personal was stripped away. Nothing was left but a non-self. This remaining essence wasn't man, woman, child, animal, spirit, or anything else. It didn't want anything, dread anything, fear anything, expect anything, but it experienced. Boy, did it ever. It saw a point of cold white light of unbearable intensity, unable to conceive of looking away, as there was no away from. There was just this, everything, space was shrunk to this singularity. There was no left or right, no up, no down, no front, no back, far away, close by. There wasn't a black canvas upon which the light existed, as there was no space. There was no color, no motion, no texture, no sound, no silence, no smell, no body, no pleasure, no pain. What there was a timeless universe convulsed to blazing icy light. That and a profound feeling of both terror and ecstasy, the awfulness of pure experience lasting indefinitely, for there was no perception of time. The experience wasn't too brief or too long, it simply was. The remnants of my shattered mind perceived the sublime, the burning furnace of being. Thank you. So I'm Christof Koch. I'm a physicist and a biologist. So as Chuck emphasized, I'm not a doctor, but I have a 40-year-long sort of professional interest and a career around studying consciousness. And the first question everyone asks is, well, what do you mean by consciousness? And I just try to describe you one particular conscious experience of the stream of consciousness that goes back from my early childhood, as far as I can remember, which of course doesn't go back to my first experience, until now. So any experience is simply subjective feelings, seeing, wanting, dreading. Right now you can hear me, that's an experience. You can see me, that's an experience. I might remind you of, Arnold Schwarzenegger or someone. I mean, just my accent. That's all consciousness, including loving, when you love, when you hate, when you dread, when you fear, when you imagine, when you dream. All of those are conscious states. And the mystery of, so this state here is relatively simple. It only had because most conscious states are very complex. There's all the structure, the building. I hear things. I feel a tingling in my body left from my sauna experience yesterday, etc. This was a very simple experience. It just had this light, this bright light, or the tunnel, the tunnel at the end of the road, terror and ecstasy. Most experiences are much more complicated, but this experience, it's a very special one. It's called it's part of a class of experience that I know you're going to hear more about in several months from now, called near-death experiences. But what I want to focus on, ultimately, near-death experience is the same type of experience like eating a slice of leftover cold pizza. It feels like something. And what's mysterious about whether it's tasting cold pizza or near-death experience, how do feelings come into the world? That if you look at the foundational equation of modern science, like quantum mechanics and relativity, there's nothing there about consciousness. If you go to the periodic table of the elements, that explains everything here on the planet Earth, there's nothing there about consciousness. If you study biology and you learn about the endless ATGC chatter that make up our nucleotide, there's nothing about consciousness. If I put one of you in a brain scanner, I don't see consciousness, I see brain activity, right? You see color pictures. If I put an EEG on your head, I don't see consciousness, I see brain waves. And so science has failed, or philosophy, or in general, we do not know how to deal with consciousness, although we all have it. And if we don't have it anymore, like in a deep sleep or anesthesia, the world disappears for us, right? You do not exist for yourself. Tonight, you're all going to go to sleep, and the first part of the night, you'll go into what's called deep sleep, right? And you do not exist for yourself. Because if I wake you up and ask you, where were you? You say, well, I don't know. I wasn't anywhere. Same thing when I anesthetize you in deep sedation. You don't exist for yourself. And life is only worth living. Everything we want from life, we want to live longer, etc. It's because we treasure consciousness. And it's only because we treasure consciousness. So what's always sort of bothered me, particularly as Chuck alluded to early on, that when my senior colleague says, no, you shouldn't study consciousness. It's best left to philosophers. They can speculate, to mystics, or to retired people or retired doctors. But not scientists, in particular before they haven't obtained the holy state of tenure, which I didn't have at the time. Anyhow, okay, so that's my introduction to what I mean by consciousness. Okay, so everything and anything you care about is ultimately comes down to having conscious experiences about it, including depression, where the experience may be very horrible. In fact, you may wish not to have experiences. So it's always about experience. And if you think about it, and this, of course, it's an ancient realization, that the only way we encounter the world is through our conscious experience. We don't know about matter. We think we know about matter, but the only way we know about matter, because I, for example, can hit it, right? Ultimately, or I'm a physicist and I look at a scope, I can measure certain things. But the only way all of us, the only thing, philosopher has this term, the only thing we're directly acquainted with are our conscious experiences. And from that, we infer a world, we infer everything. But that's an inference. We should never forget it's an inference. The first and primary, only thing we know is consciousness. So these are other words, they all mean basically the same thing. Subjective states, when you're in love, it's a subjective state. It's not objective in a sense. I can't infer it from I can't measure it directly from the outside. It's private to me. The other expression, it's about phenomenology. That's just a fancy Greek word for it feels like something. Or mental, again, it's all the same. Okay, so what's important to realize, in particular in the clinical context, because I do, although I'm not a doctor, I work quite a bit with patients, is that consciousness can be dissociated from behaviors. What do I mean by that? Well, so how do I know you're conscious? Okay, so typically you talk to people and, they respond to you in meaningful ways, and so they're also conscious. Sometimes they can't do that. For instance, when they're baby or pre-linguistic kids, or when they had a stroke. So then you have to use other means. You ask them, point towards the nose, or you ask them somewhere to behave, and so you can infer that their consciousness. And most experiments in psychology, neuroscience involve behavior, because that's how we know, for example, an animal. We love studying this in animals. That's how we know that a monkey is conscious or a mouse is conscious. Again, we infer it from its behavior. But then there are many states that science has more difficulty with, like dreaming. In dreaming, you're actively paralyzed. Part of your brain actively will paralyze, so you don't act out your dream. But you're totally, there's no overt behavior, except maybe your eyes move a little bit. When you meditate, when you sit on the cushion, for an hour or something, you try not to move at all, but yet you're in this intense, inner space. When you're tripping, right? When you're on psychedelics, some sort of psychedelics, you might just be, lying down or in lotus or whatever and have fantastic experience, travel the universe, meet God and the devil, yet without any behavior. Then also there's a challenge that many behaviors are unconscious. Many behaviors. Those are studied by psychologists. Freud, of course, popularized that. When you are in an intense emotional duress because you're in love, or you start an affair and things go south, you can discover yourself acting out, doing things that you didn't consciously intended. So we know this. There are lots of things that can go on unconsciously. So the challenge is, it's one of the challenges with consciousness, is determining consciousness in others. And there again, we have to be mindful that I assume all of you are conscious. I haven't put anyone to sleep, at least yet. So I assume all you're conscious. But that's again an assumption, it's an inference. The only consciousness I know is my own consciousness. So in babies, particularly when they're very early, like a preterm baby, or a fetus, how do we know they're conscious? What about a problem I work on, behavioral unresponsive patients? I'll come back to that they don't respond anymore. They look like they're in coma. Well, it turns out, we now know 25% of these patients, 1 out of 4 of these patients that look like they are in what used to be called a vegetative state are actually conscious, but cannot signal. And then, of course, what about non-human animals? Who believes that animals are conscious? Let's say mammals. Okay. Right. Well, it used to be, this is quite common now, but it used to be, certainly be at the height of behavior thought, like in the 50s and 40s, where at least most scientists would assume animals are unconscious, or most philosophers wouldn't assume it, because most people believe that, they still implicitly believe, and at that time it was explicit, that only humans are conscious. And what they're confusing there is language with consciousness. But inferring not only in animals, in a mouse or fly, or in babies or in a patient, it's always an inference based on the sort of, people have this technical term called an abduction. Based on the best available evidence, I abduce that these people are conscious. So for instance, here, this is an older picture of my daughter and her beloved Tosca. Okay, and how do we know Tosca is conscious? Okay, her I can ask, but the Tosca, you can talk to her and she'll respond. She'll wave her tail, and she moves. Well, a German Shepherd, she can move her ears. She can express. Charles Darwin has written very evocative about it. Her emotion in a variety of ways. They're just not linguistic. Similarity of brain architecture. So I once did this at my institute, where I had 330 neuroscientists and technicians and engineers. And I showed them 10 slides of brain cells, human brain cells and mouse brain cells. And the only slight trick I did, I removed the scale bar, because the human brain is bigger than the mouse brain. Mouse brain fits comfortably in a sugar cube. The human brain is, on the order of a liter, 10 by 10 by 10 centimeters, like this. So if you scale down the images, and you show images next to each other, people are a chance telling a mouse brain cell from a human brain cell. The basic stuff is all the same. And we don't even have the biggest brain, right? Elephants and blue whales have brains that are much bigger. Although usually in anatomy we cheat and we put things on a log scale relative to body weight, just to make sure that we come out on top of all these scales, because we believe we are the best. Okay, so we infer consciousness in these guys, like dogs, similarity of behavior, similarity of brain architectures, and of course, we're all closely evolutionary. All mammals certainly, we all descend from a little furry creature that scampered around, 65 million years ago, that survived the impact of the asteroid in the Yucatan. What we have, so consciousness is not unique to us, definitely not. We have true language, obviously. We have a very strong sense of self, and it's not true to what extent other animals have such an over-exaggerated sense of self. And now, of course, we do have this overly developed sense of our own importance. And some people in our country more than others. Now, one challenge with conscience is that we may not experience the same reality. So you've probably all seen this, right? The dress. It's a very famous image, went viral in 2015. It's a random image that somebody texted of a wedding dress at a wedding. And then people online had this fight, well, what color is it? So who sees this, the colors here as black and blue? All right, so about a third of you. And who sees it as gold and white? A lot of deluded people in the audience. I'm sorry, it must be the mountain air. So you can go, there's a great Wikipedia page called just #thedress, because this divided people. What is the real color? Because what's remarkable about this simple picture, it doesn't happen that often, but what's remarkable about this simple picture, roughly, depending on age, etc., 1/3 to 1/2 of people sees this as obviously black and blue. There's no question about it. And the other people see it obviously as white and gold. It's not something where you have to think and infer, it just looks that way. And so you infer, well, the other guy is crazy. Now, we think we know why people have this, and then people ask, well, what's the real color? There is no real color. What there is, as far as we can tell, they're photons that come from the sun that strike that are reflected off the wedding dress, get reflected in complicated ways, and then make it into the eye, and are then analyzed by the brain. And we construct something called color. What there is sort of objectively, there are photons at a particular wavelength. But color, like any other experience, are constructed by your mind. They're subjective. And people can have very different subjective experiences. Well, this is sort of, fun thing, for a party to talk about in terms of colors. Think about January 6th. Think about October 7th. Think about political things where the very same facts are interpreted radical different depending on your culture, and your upbringing, right? So what sort of true for perception is true also for the social constructed reality. It's a reality that we construct by selectively taking facts or suppressing other facts, and we simply don't perceive it, and then we cannot understand why anyone else could see it any other way. Well, they must be at best deluded, or at worst they're evil, because the facts are so obvious, and this is obviously the fact. Okay, then there's a disconcerting, this is a more disconcerting, at least conceptually, experience. Fixate at the center of the cross. It probably would be best, but it's too late, to dim the lights. So if you really keep your eyes steady and fixated on that central cross, what do you see? Isn't this cool? Right? So you see a single green disc. If you come close and really keep your eyes fixated, it's very obvious. What's interesting there, let me just freeze it, there's no green disc here, right? In fact, there are 11 pink discs. There's no single green disc. So it's a very complicated visual illusion that it consists of 3 different visual illusions. And so what this teaches us, that what you perceive may not actually truly exist out there. Because this, as I said, this is what seems to be out there, 11 pink disc. What you see is a single green disc that travels. So again, the bottom line here is we live in a reality that we construct, and this reality can differ partly from what other people see. Now, most of the time, at least for visual perception, we agree. It's consensual reality, right? Because otherwise we couldn't get up all of the morning and we would constantly run into each other or collide on the freeway. So most of the time we share consensual reality, also evolutionary, would have to be like that. But particularly for social aspects of reality, there the construct becomes much more, the fact that it's a construct becomes much more important. So the technical term is every organism, and we're just talking about Homo sapiens. Of course, different animals have very different sensorium. They experience a radical different world. And so this is emphasized by probably one of the most famous of all philosophers, the German idealist Immanuel Kant, right? And he argued, and I think entirely correctly, he argued already 2 years ago that everything is a construct. We don't access the real thing, what he calls the noumena. We only access the phenomena. And including space and time, they're not given, they're not objectively given. And physicists in foundations of physics now agree with that. They are construct. Everything else is a construct. So again, Chuck mentioned the Elizabeth Koch. She has this beautiful metaphor of a perception box. So we all live in a perception box. We all have our own perception boxes. They differ in minor or in major ways. And very often, particularly if people are anxious or depressed, they're very close. And we want to develop techniques to open the perception box, to make you feel more at home in the universe, more open, more curious to the world. And we see this in something that's called placebo effect that you may have heard in the clinical context, right? That our belief, that's finally what it is, that our belief in the efficiency of a technique, whether that's a little white tablet that's supposed to relieve me of pain or depression or whatever else, or a particular medical procedure, that this belief by itself can act as a very powerful, either beneficial therapeutic agent, then it's called a placebo, or it can be negative, nocebo. So, but this is again our conscious belief in the efficiency of what other people tell us, what our friends and neighbors tell us. If everyone tells us that this new thingamajiggy, whatever it is working, then it is actually very likely to work in us. And then people say, well, that's just a placebo effect. But it's such a powerful thing, and if it helps you, right? It doesn't matter whether it's your mind or your brain. If it helps you deal with life's complexity, then you should be happy for it. All right, so I study this thing. So that's the human brain, that's the mouse brain. As I said, they're rather similar. This one is essentially 1,000 times bigger version of that. Not quite. I mean, there are differences, of course, but overall, it's remarkable how similar particular mammalian brains are. In fact, the number of genes are the same, the number of cell types are the same, whether it's a mouse or a human. So many, many years ago, I worked with Francis Crick, who co-discovered DNA, and because we're both intensely interested in the problem of consciousness, and we said, well, how can we make progress here? It's been around. The first book on consciousness was probably written by Aristotle, De Anima, Psyche, on the soul, where he talks about different forms of consciousness. That's 2,300 years ago. And today, at least when we started, we felt, well, we don't really know that much more after 2,300 years, which is a little bit shocking. So we sort of articulated this purely empirical program, no matter whether you're a physicalist or an idealist or dualist or panpsychist, or whatever school of philosophy you happen to believe in, or religious. We can all agree the brain, not the heart. Right? Most people on the planet thought the heart was where you love and hate, right? And you still say that, darling, I love you with all my heart. Well, that's not true. I love you with my hypothalamus. And my prefrontal cortex. But I still love you. So we instituted this empirical program, what we call looking, this is now generally used, neural correlates of consciousness. And here's the definition. So essentially the footprints of consciousness. So if you see, for example, a German Shepherd, so you have a conscious experience of a German Shepherd. Are there particular type of neurons that are active? Or are all the neurons active, but they're active in a particular mode, like they oscillate or they synchronize? Or it's only a subset of neurons, or they're in a special part of the brain? Or these neurons, inside of them, there's something special, including like the collapse of the wave function? These are all sort of arguments that people have now made. And when I just think about my German Shepherd, when closing my eyes, are the same neurons active as when the German Shepherd is actually there? Or when I dream of her, are the same neurons active, right? And what happens when I think about a cat? Are just slightly different neurons? Are there cat neurons and dog neurons? Turns out to be true, particularly for dogs. I don't know about cats. So these are all, and you can stick people in a magnet and ask them to imagine one thing and to imagine another thing. You can look for people that have lesions that, for example, are unable to perceive, let's say, faces, or unable to perceive motion, or that are colorblind. And so you can study this. You can look at the genes. You can look at the brain activity. You can do very similar things in animals. You can train monkeys, or today it's a lot of done in mice. You can train mice to tell you what the mouse is seeing. In fact, most of psychedelic research is done on mice. There are thousands of tripping mice. And then if you remove whatever you find, if it's these particular neurons, then if you remove them or turn them off somehow using a neurosurgeon's electrodes or some fancy Neuralink-like technology, well, then you wouldn't have the experience anymore. Or if you use a Neuralink-like technology, like Elon Musk's Neuralink company, to stimulate the brains, as neurosurgeons do routinely during pre-op, then you would get the experience, although there isn't anything there in the outside world. But I can directly stimulate, as you want, your brain, and in some parts of the brain, I can evoke very specific percepts, not everywhere. All right, so this is a paper that's going to come out in Nature that I'm an author on, where we do something, I'm not going to explain it to you, where we can sort of study the footprints of consciousness. This is in people consciously seeing things versus unconsciously seeing them. So the same input, but they don't see them. And so that's a vigorous debate. In fact, so I'd made a famous bet with probably America's best-known, or second best-known philosopher, David Chalmers. So David Chalmers, have you heard about something called the hard problem? Hard, like this, hard. So there's this Australian-American philosopher who became famous 35 years ago by saying there's a hard problem of consciousness. Fundamentally, it says there are two worlds. There's a world of our experiences, and there's a world of the brain. And so ultimately, yes, this program of the NCC will run its course, and we know these neurons over here, when they're active, you have this feeling over here. But why should any piece of matter, if you think about it, why should any piece of matter, no matter how construed, why should that go hand in hand with feeling? It's utterly, it comes just as a miracle. It's like, Aladdin, when he rubs the brass lamp and suddenly the genie comes out. Why should that be? So he calls that the hard problem. And I was young and ambitious, and I thought, oh, come on, David, give me a break. In 25 years, we'll solve this problem. This was in 1998, so we had a big meeting in New York City in 2023, and it's a long, complicated story. It's written up in all the newspaper. The short and long of it, I was wrong in the sense that we did not solve this problem 2 years ago, okay? There's still lots of controversy among academics which exact bits and pieces of the brain are really necessary for you to have a conscious experience. So I handed him 6 bottles of very good Madeira. Right? But he admits that this is an empirical program, and sooner or later we will solve it. We won't understand why this activity in the brain over here will give rise to feeling, but we will find the neural correlates of consciousness for any one particular experience. It's just a question of time and funding and human ingenuity, but there's no reason this program won't. What's that? Sick. Okay. All right. So, let's skip this. Building consciousness detector. I think you're trying to communicate something about time. We all learn time is a construct. And for me, 5 minutes just passed, okay? So I started a company to test for presence of consciousness, since, as I mentioned, 1 out of every 4 patients who's unresponsive is actually conscious, and a lot of these people die by what's called withdrawal of life-sustaining therapy, typically after 4 to 5 days. So it's a big unaddressed clinical need. So let me talk the second part of my talk, where I talk about particular type of experiences, not just general experiences, but transformative experiences. So these are brief. They were really only discovered by science. They've been around forever, of course, in humanity, but they were really only taken seriously as a scientific thing to be studied 20 years ago, 30 years ago, very recently. Before, the only place where you could find them was in bookstores under esoterica, where you have witchcraft and spiritualism and near death. Near death was also sort of completely woo-woo. So we now know those are brief, unexpected experiences. They can last, well under an hour, or they can be a few hours, that can permanently change your life, permanently, and usually almost always for the better. I mean, sometimes they can leave you with PTSD, but very often they can lead to these positive changes, loss of fear of death. So I totally lost my fear of death after my near-death experience. Loss of anxiety, loss of cynicism, detachment from, ROI and material possession, and really an orientation towards the greater good, because you realize that life is beautiful and we all want to enjoy it, and you develop this compassion for suffering in others. And there's very much a distinct before and after this event. So this includes a whole variety of experiences that people have studied under a different name. One is religion conversion experience. Most of us are familiar with that from Christianity. Mystical experiences, aesthetic experiences, near-death experiences. So typically they go hand in hand with these feelings of oceanic boundlessness. In fact, the title of my book, Then I Am Myself, the World, comes from a different experience, mystical experience I had. And they come from a title of a lyrics in Tristan and Isolde by Richard Wagner, where the 2 eponymous lovers unite and become one with each other and with the entire world. This is known as call today oceanic boundlessness, and this is a very common experience during mystical experience. Bliss and or terror, and you got to remember, when you think about terror, awful, what the etymology is awful, is full of awe. You know, and some people derive it, sort of the theologian Otto, what's the guy, he has this mysterium tremendum. When you're in the presence, again in religious, in Christian writing, you see being present in the presence of God, when you're sort of filled with awe and terror. So this often comes in these near-death experiences. Loss of perception of space-time. The external world typically disappears. The sense of self typically disappears. There's no more ego. You know, you leave planet ego. You become selfless, which I think is a great thing, best thing could happen. And some people sometimes can also encounter spirits and divine messengers. Partly, of course, this is all cultural dependent. Different people from different culture will have different experiences. Although the first 3 or 4 are fairly common also in other cultures. This is the best one we know from the Bible, from the New Testament, the Pauline conversion on the road to Damascus, from Paul turning him from Saul into Christianity's greatest apostle, St. Paul. And you can read these other saints, Christian saints, or, you know, from Meister Eckhart, of course, one of the greatest Christian mystics of the 16th century, Rumi and Kali Gibran. So you find them in all religious traditions, not just Christian ones, the one that I'm most familiar with. You can see him, you can have him, in fact, you can go to websites, and there are websites where you can see thousands of them. This is Jane Goodall, who just got the national medal. She had a mystical experience. In this case, totally unexpected. So very often, they come totally out of the blue. You're there brushing your teeth, and suddenly you realize, oh my God, I suddenly get it. I suddenly understand it. And this understanding, it's called a technical term, noetic quality, from nous, knowledge, the Greek, is ineffable. It's very difficult to explain it to other people when you come back from this experience. But you just know something. You know something, and you take that knowledge with you until you die. Beautiful. So Arthur Schopenhauer, you know, the very dour, pessimist German philosopher, you know, he talks very explicitly about this. What Buddhists call non-dual experience. The individual has lost himself. He's pure, will-less, painless, timeless subject of knowledge. Because there's still something there that experiences, right? It's not that there's nothing there. There is something there that experience, but that experience, it doesn't come with a sense of self anymore. You know, the bodily sense of me, of Christof, knowing what I had for breakfast, having certain predilection and behavioral traits, all of that is gone. Near-death experience, I just talked about them. We now know a whole lot more about them. There's this great book that just came out by the journalist Sebastian Junger, In My Time of Dying. He's non-religious. He had this very powerful near-death experience and talks about it. And again, this is more real than real. You finally feel that you've gotten to the heart of the universe. You really understand it now. So scholars in their particular states have written this famous book that based on which psychologists and psychiatrists like Chuck, or people who study psychedelics, particularly psilocybin, they typically will give you a questionnaire. It's called an MEQ 30, and that's based, they want to assess to what extent you, during your mushroom experience, had this mystical experience. So typically they ask for these this is what defines, according to Stacy, at least in this tradition, what defines a mystical experience. But I have to emphasize, everyone, depending on their background and culture, may have different components. Okay, so it turns out, I found this fascinating. So I've written about this in my current book, because to me this was novel, that as far as I can tell, every culture on the planet's history has had ways to get into these transformative experiences. In my own Christian tradition, you see that in the 3rd and 4th and 5th century, when people socially isolated themselves, lived by themselves, you know, in the desert or in these walled-in rooms, these anchorites, to get into these altered states to directly experience God. Self-flagellation, you know, following the Black Death, 14th century Europe, you know, when they whipped themselves into a frenzy. In Japan, they have this really weird, I mean, to me weird, but who am I to say it's weird, self-mummification, where they essentially, the last 2 years of their life, they just eat this diet of resin, and then they just meditate all day in this underground chamber, and once a day they ring a bell until they stop ringing a bell. Then they're dead and living mummies. Strange. Chanting an ecstatic dance to induce trance. Who of you have been at a rave, at a club? Rave. Doing rave? I think even if you don't take any substances, so I used to be a big clubber, I was a dancer, ballet dancer and clubber, and no drinking whatsoever, just water. You can dance for 4 hours, you totally get into this altered state. When you combine with social rituals, singing, dancing, with or without consuming substances, there are all these different ways to do this, and different cultures do it. The Pentecostal charismatic church, that we, at least our social economic strata, we don't think too much about them, but if you look at them, they have some remarkable phenomenology that really shares the phenomenology with these other manipulations, which goes, by the way, hand in hand with high mental health. There's Santa Daime, so, ayahuasca. There's the American Native Church that combined it with mescaline. Who of you have been in Burning Man or EDC? Okay, where you take a lot of different substances. And you can dance, and you can do it at midnight, and you can really get into weird altered states. Holotropic breath work, really powerful. So I tried this, my wife and I tried it recently twice, and it's amazing. Within half an hour of breathing, you do nothing else, no drugs, no other substances. You can go into complete dissociative states where the entire world disappears, where all you see is a bright light. You can go into a completely altered state, and as soon as you stop breathing, within 30 seconds you return to baseline. Amazing. I discovered this, I'm a long-distance runner and climber, and you can get, and we all know the states of flow, right? Particularly in a place like this. Why do we like flow? Because partly I think it's so addictive states of flow that you can induce by doing things like ultramarathons or long climbs on big walls. Because you have to be hyper-focused on what you're doing, but you forget everything else, and you become, in the best of all worlds, you become selfless. You lose the notion of self, and you experience the world as transcendent. Right? You do these physical things that can be amazing, and just the world is so beautiful. Attentional engaging activities could also be more low-key. Fly fishing. I had a friend, David Anderson, who goes into this entire rapture about fly fishing, can completely lose himself. I used to have it, and I know many of my colleagues do, writing code. Maybe unlikely to some of you, but writing code, you can completely lose the sense of passage of time. Climbing. Sweat lodge, talking about sauna and thermal exposure. Sweat lodge, what the American Indians did. Sauna. Controlled hypothermia, like being tested here for depression. But here I'm just talking about the acute effects. I'm not talking any potential long-term beneficial effect. Just the acute effects of these manipulation can bring you into an altered states. Sensory deprivation, like flotation tank, dark retreats, where you go into the dark for 5 days. No people. No TV, no phone, no books, no reading, nothing. Just you inside a room with food and a bathroom and 5 days by yourself, where you really discover who you are. Then, of course, in the 19th century, we in the West encountered, coming from China mainly, opium, hashish, Near East, nitrous oxide, diethyl and ether. And then, of course, post-World War II, World War II with LSD, and post-World War II, where we discovered psilocybin, magic mushroom, mescaline, LSD, DMT, 5-MeO, DMT, ayahuasca, and other things. This is the only technique I know that can do it long-term for your entire life without doing anything heroic, like doing an ultramarathon or breathing, incredible hard, or, exposing you to, meditation can put you into these altered states. All right, so 2 more slides. Psychedelics, I was asked to say something about them. So from a point of view, once again, I'm not a doctor, I'm a basic scientist, and I'm of course curious about these things. So the great thing about serotonergic psychedelic is that given all the drugs we take, starting from opium on one end and nicotine and coffee, coffee being the most widely consumed substance. On the other hand, this one is if properly done, among the safest. You get a transient increase in blood pressure and heart rate during the acute phase. It's very difficult to overdose on these drugs. There's no withdrawal symptoms, neither in animals nor in people. There's very little tolerance. There are no cartels. There's no cartel for ayahuasca. There's no cartel. No, I mean, let's really think about it. Why is there no cartel for ayahuasca or for psilocybin, while there are cartels for opium? Animals don't typically self-administrate. But of course, how many of you have had experiences? Okay, well, quite a lot. The effect on the mind is very powerful, very powerful. And so we've learned, and we need to learn more about them now that we might, ultimately they might make it as a medical treatment. So typically we screen in all these clinical trials for certain psychiatric conditions, for which they're definitely counterindicated: schizophrenia, psychosis, derealization. We all know the same substance in the same person who can be profoundly influenced by the setting, the set. Are you doing this under the freeway? Are you doing it by, with a supporting trips sitter in a beautiful, on a blue day like this in the forest? Makes a huge difference. And how do you feel if you just had a huge row with your partner, versus you really feel happy with life? Makes a big difference. So they are highly variable, partly because they amplify pre-existent unconscious fears, desires, or suppressed wishes. Those things can become amplified and can become out. Of course, currently they're still highly illegal because they're all Schedule I substances. Although under the new administration, we'll see that it might change because RFK is a big proponent of them. So these are the chemical structures of the 4 of them, and they're all very similar to serotonin, which is naturally present in all of our bodies. In fact, most of the serotonin is in your gut. A lot of the serotonin controls your blood pressure, which is where the name comes from. Serotonin means serum is blood, and tonus is the tone of the blood. But there are also 14 different types of serotonin receptor in the brain. So I'm interested, and I came to them a couple of years ago, 10 years ago, because I take the motto of the Royal Society, nullius in verba, very serious, take no one's word for it. Got to do it yourself. So why do people take it? Well, if you just ask regular people at a rave or at a psychedelic retreat, they want to experience altered states of consciousness with just the acute altered state. Because it's very weird, it's very interesting what you can encounter, as you know. But now we've discovered, or we've rediscovered something that we learned already partly in the 50s and 60s, or if we would have listened to some native traditions, that they have very attractive long-term therapeutic potential to cure a variety of mental disorders, including treatment-resistant depression, major depressive disorders, PTSD, generalized anxiety disorders, and you name it. They're being now tried for behavior unresponsive patients, for migraines, for all sorts of conditions, because we believe, neuroscientists believe, they induce neuroplasticity. They bring you back to a state of immaturity that you had when you were very young, where your brain could still very rapidly, and the neurons and synapses could change, and we think that's what's going on. Some people are interested in doing psychedelic because it allows you get these subconscious early traumatic experiences, re-experience them, and can maybe therefore recontextualize it and reframe them. And I'm primarily interested in that because I do believe that some type of these mystical experience, whether you just have them spontaneously or while you meditate or doing psychedelics, can teach us something about what truly exists, ultimate reality. But that's a topic for another talk. So we don't understand most of the universe. You won't hear a lot of scientists say that, but it's true. So I think it's very important to be humble when we seek to understand what we call reality. And when people say, oh, I understand what reality is, it's just the physical, don't believe them. They don't know what they're talking about. And also don't believe them when they tell you they understand psychedelics. We don't. And we should remember the great Shakespeare in Hamlet, there are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
So I hope you can see the connection here, right? Especially this talk about transformative experiences, that if you can find strategies that on some reliable basis induce these sort of things, if you can do it the right kind of way and induce these sort of changes, you can work with them clinically. It's a new way of doing that. If you're just waiting around for a transformative experience, they happen, it's like you said, but not going to happen today, not going to happen next, who knows? But if you come into one of our...
Some it may never happen.
And some it may never happen, yeah. But if you come into one of the studies, let's say with the psychedelic study that we're getting ready to do, yes.
Can we just ask, who of you had something like a mystical experience?
That's a good question, yes.
Okay, so quite a few.
Yeah, it's quite a few. But if you come into the study and you're depressed and you're treated with psilocybin, because everybody in our study is treated with psilocybin, 50-60% of people will have their minds blown in this particular way. And so it's a way to harness this. But this is what I want to ask you. So the other thing that we're doing currently, and this study is already underway, seems very, very different. We're actually taking people that are depressed and we're sticking them in a special box. Really, thank you, Dr. Mason. This is actually, we're working off her work, what she does at UCSF, and we cook them half to death, right? Because it turns out that time-limited exposure to high heat has a rapid and in many people pretty powerful antidepressant effect. That's why saunas make people feel good. Dr. Koch, one of his conditions for coming out here to give this lecture was that we cook him in our machine. He wanted to see what it was like. And the study we're doing is half the people just get cooked, and the other half get cooked and they go right into a cold plunge, right? So they get cooked and frozen, right? Because we're curious about whether the freezing part does anything in addition to the heat. So Christof came in, and there were only two of us in the room. Dr. Mason, Ashley did all the work. I sat there. And I watched this thing unfurl over almost 2 hours. And so I want to ask you about the experience, because at one point you were quoting poetry. You were, in fact, quoting something from Blade Runner, this beautiful thing, which you can quote to us again. But I wonder if you talk about that a little bit, because it's a very concrete thing to heat people up. It's not like giving them a psychedelic where we know that we're looking at these sort of experiences. But one of the things that I've observed about the heat treatment is that it induces these very acute, powerful, sort of positive pro-social states of mind. So I'm curious, tell people a little bit about your experience yesterday, because I was fascinated by the little bit you've told me.
Well, so somehow we also had music in the background. We had your playlist, which was classical.
And we had Dr. Mason, yes, doing the
Pachelbel, some Mozart, soothing music. And somehow, you get warm and then hot, and you focus. I could very easily, it was very easy for me to just focus and get lost in the music. And then you can get not quite in a state like this, because every 10 minutes there's an interruption. You may have to, someone puts ice, she puts ice on you, or she puts a cold towel, your head is sticking out, or you have to adjust other things.
The rectal probe is what he's talking about. You just try to be polite. We have to monitor the temperature, so every few minutes we have to say, can you please just put...
Which sometimes makes it a little bit difficult to achieve a mystical state when you just have to fiddle around with that. But it definitely shares some phenomenology, some way of feeling a little bit similar to some of these. It's certainly an altered state. There's no question it's an altered state.
And it was for you a emotionally positive altered state.
Oh yeah, it was very positive. And I still feel today. I feel very buoyant, very, very vibrant, very much alive.
Right, and you were not depressed going into the box.
No,
definitely not depressed. So it's interesting how some of these treatments, the slide you had that I find so interesting, and this is, a lot of our work is around this, is that there are a number of ways of achieving these states, and so many of them have been around for thousands of years, and they were often discovered in a spiritual context. Any sense why? I mean, it's sort of interesting. Why is that it was often, sort of, it seems like religions often were the first sort of movements that grabbed these things.
Well, because if you're religious, you try to have a direct experience of God, right? Let's say of God. And for that, you need to go away from people and away from any distraction to truly experience God. It makes it much easier. And so they discovered when you socially isolate, or when you go into states of fasting, or when you somehow subject your body to what, like in the American Sioux dance, the dance.
The sun dance where you hook the thing in your chest.
Yeah, it's extremely painful. You can do what's called dissociate yourself. So dissociation is a state when you're not really aware of your environment anymore, but in your own world. And somehow those people that are seeking, that are either spiritual or religious, they're much more likely to push themselves to go to these states, while people who are just uninterested, they just live their life every day, they don't think about it. It's much more difficult to achieve a state if you just do one thing after the other and you never break out of your routine. You have to somehow have this. It's much easier if you have this. I can tell you a story. I grew up Catholic. I served as an altar boy, the old Latin Mass. I probably went to 2,000 Masses, okay? And I got the host, and I went back to my pew, and I always, do all of that. And I was always waiting for the burning bush. I was always waiting for that booming voice, and I never got it. And then I do some of these things, and boom, off you go. No, seriously, you encounter suddenly the divine in a very different way. I mean, there wasn't a Jesus or an old man with a beard, but what you encounter, you feel this ultimately reality, which is mental, which is pure, it's a cosmic conscience, whatever you call it. It all sounds very cheesy, I know, but when you encounter that, your life is not the same. And then you have the problem that's epitomized in this great book by this Buddhist scholar, After the Ecstasy, the Laundry.
Yes.
Because you still have to go back after you became one with the universe or whatever, and do your taxes and, live a good life with your partner and your family, etc. So then all these other practices, particularly spiritual practices, meditation practices, I think are helpful to integrate this experience. Because after, you might feel, well, after 2 or 3 years, it's impact lessened. So the way to do it is you have this profound experience, and that allows you to change your habits, your behavior, the way you interact with others.
Yes. And interestingly, so we're talking about psychedelics. One of the things psychedelics had a kind of a minor boom scientifically in the 50s, early 60s, and then
huge boom, the age of Aquarius.
No, but that's yes. Then there was the explosion out into the culture, and then it got squashed, right, for a variety of reasons. But in the last 20 years, there's been this sometimes called a renaissance, where people began to study it scientifically. And Roland Griffith, who was really kind of the American pioneer, I think, in this. One of the things he often said to me was that in the early studies, one of the things that struck them is they would give a high dose of psilocybin to healthy volunteers, folks like you. And that people would, after that experience, start eating better, they would sleep better, they would go back to church if they were inclined, but they would essentially begin, instead of feeling like I got to whip myself to sort of do things that are more health relevant, they had this sort of affective, it became an affective drive thing where they wanted to do it. And it was really quite, this is one of the things he was amazed by, was that sometimes, if the transformative experience, when it really works for people, it does set in motion more of a capacity to then begin to change, to begin to adopt healthier lifestyles. I
mean, we all know how difficult it is to eat less or drink less or do all the other things less. So it takes something, at least under this impetus, it's much easier to do.
Yes.
After you had such an experience.
So real quick, and then I know we'll go to questions. But so you said something you said it now, but you said something at the end. So you were really this thing about neural correlates of consciousness. You didn't make as much of it as it is in the neuroscientific world. This was this kind of radical idea at the time, right? That you could scientifically say, if I see a Saint Bernard, I like Saint Bernards, but if you see a German Shepherd, that it'd be possible to say that German Shepherd, your experience of that German Shepherd can be found in the brain, and we're going to figure out every brain cell you need to have that experience and none of the ones that you don't need, right? And then theoretically, if you turned off those brain cells, boom, bye-bye German Shepherd, right?
I will use slightly different language. The
Okay.
experience is not in the brain.
Okay, but most people that pick that up would say that the experience was in the brain, or they'd say the experience didn't really exist. It's a reductionist physical idea. With sort of classic science. You've maintained a rigorous scientific approach, but you've drifted from that a lot.
Well, not from the rigorous scientific approach.
No, not from the rigorous
still published in Nature.
Yes, I know. But that sense of this sort of pure physicality.
Yeah, so most people believe what's called physicalism. The only thing that really exists is physical, atoms or fields and energy, and everything else emerges. And the challenge has been over the last 100 years, well, how does consciousness emerge? And people tie themselves into knot, and they haven't managed to explain how feelings emerge from a piece of matter, like a piece of furniture of the universe, like the brain. And so to the extent that many philosophers, like Dan Dennett, used to be who died last year, the doyen of American philosopher, he just argued, you guys are all confused about conscience. Conscience doesn't really exist in the sense that we mean it. It's all a figment of our imagination, which is astonishing that he gets away with that. That's like saying, I don't exist. I don't really exist. I'm just a figment of my own imagination. I mean, it's just mind-boggling. But it was considered very sophisticated thinking among the cognoscendi.
Absolutely. Okay, let's open it up for questions. Are we going to pass around the mic to capture it, or do you want me to just repeat the questions, or what would you like me to do, James? I am at your disposal.
All right, before I give instructions on Q&A, could we give them a round of applause? This could have been a 5-day intensive, and we're trying to pack it all into 90 minutes. I did warn Dr. Koch that we have a lot of great brains here in Vail with a lot of great questions, so we've left good, ample time for us. I will come around with the microphone. It will be on. Please speak into the microphone, and not near the microphone or around it. And if you can add a little context, but try to find your question as quickly as possible so that we can get to as many as we can.
So I can actually ask a question.
Yeah, let's find a question mark in there. Who wants to kick us off? I knew, Gary, I knew it. Get us going.
I didn't hear you mention anything about the consciousness that with plants or crystals or anything other than humans or animals or mammals.
Yeah, so some people now, some scientists now claim that it might feel like something to be a plant, sentient being. That's possible. We know extremely little about that. There have been very few experiments. I'm not ruling it out. I'm not asserting it is. It may well be possible. You also have to ask, when you're looking at a plant like a tree, is the entire tree conscious, or is it just is it just individual cells within it? It's an interesting possibility that, at least science has never considered before. So I don't have any answers. But it's a question that we can now begin to ask and maybe answer in a rational, scientific, empirically accessible manner.
Yep, sure.
Hi, thank you. This is so interesting. How does the subconscious mind fit into consciousness?
Yeah, so the subconscious mind in a conceptual sense is much easier to explain because, at least fundamentally, right, you can argue, well, there's lots of stuff going on. I have no idea how I talk, right? I have no idea, syntax. I learned it way back in school in German, and then I translate it automatically into English. I don't access that, right? So that's subconscious. And so we know there are particular parts of the brain that are responsible for that. And that's not particular, from a basic scientific point of view, that's not so difficult to answer. Yeah, my liver does all sorts of complicated things. When I drink a glass of wine, it has to, alcohol dehydrogenase and all of that. And I have no idea how it does it. Does it all unconsciously, and they're very complicated mechanism. What I find somewhat more interesting is when you can use techniques like psychoanalysis or like psychedelics to bring some content that is typically suppressed, maybe actively suppressed, either repressed or suppressed, if you follow Freud, that somehow there are techniques to surface that and maybe help you with early childhood experiences that you had suppressed, but that affect you in all sorts of strange ways. So how does that happen? How does the suppression happen? To what extent is there suppression voluntarily? To what extent is it involuntarily? Those are questions that only very recently neuroscience, so there used to be this complete, Chinese wall between people like psychoanalysts who, Jung or Freud or Adler who studied that, and neuroscientists, because that was considered totally woo-woo. But now people are beginning to use things like imaging technology, fMRI and EEG, to try to translate some of that, what psychoanalysts have learned about the unconscious and the repressed conscious, etc., to try to find some more rigorous scientific basis for that. So it's an exciting time, I think.
Psilocybin has been around for many years, and yet it's not commonly accepted. And I wonder, how long is it going to be before some of the kind of treatments you talk about are covered, say, by insurance, so that it's mainstream?
Do you want me to take that one? Yeah, it's more my bailiwick. Because what I work in really, one of the things I do is work with a nonprofit that's working to get psilocybin approved by the FDA. I think psilocybin will be approved by the FDA for the treatment of depression in 2027 or 2028. Now, might not happen, but that's sort of our best guess at this point. We could talk about Colorado, because it's going to be possible this year to actually get psilocybin as a treatment for things like depression via state law. Insurance is a fascinating issue, though, because one of the things that we worry about, one of the things I worry about, is the fact that, well, one of the really nice things about this treatment is it's the first time in forever that a drug, psilocybin has huge effects on the brain, and all the sort of therapy and all that part are put together, right? Because if you come see me as a psychiatrist, I write a script for Prozac, thank you, bye, see you 10 minutes, right? This is not like that. The way the FDA is wanting psilocybin to be done at this point, there need to be two people that are trained. They meet with you for a few hours before the dosing session. When you come in, this is how we'll do it in Vail. When you come in, those two people will be with you for 8 hours while you undergo this experience. And then they will meet with you for several hours over the subsequent weeks afterwards. Whatever the drug costs, and of course, if commercial people develop it, that drug's going to cost $20,000, something like that maybe, the way things work. The nonprofit I work for, we say we won't be undersold. We would sell it for much less than that, but just the clinician's time is going to be expensive, right? So getting insurance to pay for it is going to be this really fascinating conundrum. There's going to be this drive to try to figure out how can we give it as cheaply as possible, because, a lot of things in America work that way. And so there's going to be this tension between how low can we go, how much can we cut out of all the sort of therapeutic, personal stuff and turn it into a drug.
Do we need two therapists?
Yeah, do we need two therapists? And there's a whole discussion about that, and people go both ways. And that's going to press against, how much effectiveness do you lose if you take away that support, that setting that we talked about, that Christof talked about, and safety. Because, there's a beautiful paper called The Theological Reckoning with Bad Trips. If you ever remember that, it was written by a religious scholar from Harvard who was in a psychedelic study, a psilocybin study at Hopkins, who was in for her depression, and she had two treatments, and the second treatment was horrific for her. And, she eventually had to go on psych meds for that. So these agents are really powerful. They're going to help 95% of the people probably that, get benefit. But when millions of people take them, like everything, there's going to be risks, right? And so, there's a lot less risks when you do it really safely, but that costs more too. So it's a great question. But what we do know, I think, is that you give me 100 people with depression, and I give you psilocybin the way we do it in our studies, you will see, not everybody benefits for everything, but you'll see a huge improvement in that group of people. But we don't know yet how it's going to be paid for, and we don't know exactly how it's going to be dosed or how often.
What was the percentage in your recent study, the one last year that came out?
Yeah. So the JAMA article. So we did a 104-person study where we gave half the people a high dose of psilocybin, half the people placebo, and these people were really depressed. And about 50% of them had a full remission, 6 weeks after a single dose. One pill. It's in your body for 6 hours, 8 hours. 6 weeks later, boom. It's astounding, right? So, and in some conditions, it's even more so, like end of life, and maybe also things like alcoholism. The signal is profound. That's why it's ironic. These are the most ancient psychotropic medicines known to man, probably, and they're the hottest things going because, and they're so novel. Prozac, yeah, take it every day, right? Paxil, whatever. Whereas this is this totally different sort of way of thinking about things. Good.
Circling back to subconscious and conscious, I believe that neuroscientists are of the opinion that we are about 95% subconscious and about 5% conscious. The effect of psilocybin, is that in the area of the conscious and subconscious brain, or one or the other?
Wait, I don't fully understand the question. So yes, it's true that the majority of activity in my brain probably relates to unconscious things, like speech, like motor control, like itching unconsciously while I talk to you. Just like 100% of, or maybe 90% of the rest of my body does its thing, whether it's the kidney or the heart, unconscious. So that's true. But what was the question?
So the treatment with psilocybin, does that tackle one or the other, as in the conscious part of the brain or the unconscious?
Yeah.
Yes, or both.
Well, what do you think?
Well, I mean, so I didn't have a traumatic childhood, but I know from others who had that whether it's doing a long, year-long or 2-year-long psychotherapy or while doing one of these, I've seen it in doing ayahuasca ceremony, where they can have very bad experiences, but they can then, where they relive some of their bad childhood, traumatic childhood experiences, but then it's a net benefit to them, where some of the substance and the ceremony can resurf, can make conscious these long-term suppressed experiences where they channel them. It looks like they become psychotic and all of that, but the next day or the next week or the next month, they say it was one of the best experiences I've ever had, and it allowed me to finally confront this thing that had haunted me for the rest of my life, for my last 10 years, and I now can go on in a much healthier way. So what happens is, I think, you resurface old material that you work very hard to suppress because it's just too painful to think about.
Right. And I think one popular but not fully proven idea is that if you look at brain studies of psychedelics like psilocybin, they seem to cause the sort of egoic part of the brain, if I can put it that way, like the default mode network, to become sort of less connected. And there's this sort of idea, if you were to simplify it, that just like you said, that basically they have this effect where they turn off this top-down control, and it allows these sort of much deeper areas, like parts of the sort of temporal lobes that harbor memories, that harbor these emotions,
well,
to come up.
And I think they work to the extent you can get self-dissolution, and your self fights back. Because yourself doesn't want to disappear. Yourself, your entire life, yourself is in charge, always in charge. The self always looks out for me. Christof is always there and looks out for his long-term benefit. So, and sometimes Christof can get in the way of enjoying the beauty of the universe, right? And can do all sorts of other dysfunctional things. So the trick is to fool the self, to somehow let go, no matter what technique you use, meditation, chanting, trance, psychedelics, because then, yes, then you can experience these other things. You can experience the beauty of the universe outside you, or the things can come up that you can then finally deal with without the big guy, the big ego, getting in the way and shutting it down.
And then often, in these experiences, so my grad students just published on this, we published on this, that there's a pattern sometimes, especially if people are struggling in a psychedelic experience. The first part will often be this sort of psychological stuff, facing what happened to you, facing traumas. And if you have a sense that you've sort of dealt with that in a new way, or been able to tolerate it, or have a feeling that you can have more control over it, it often sparks that unitary, mystical sort of loss of self or sense of deeper connection. So those two are very often, I think, connected, and that fits with the mystical literature, right? With the dark night of the soul, sort of preceding the moment of the mystical union with God.
Then the challenge just to integrate that now into your life, your remaining years of life, so it has long-term benefits.
MAPS has been working on trying to get this legalized since Nixon's war on drugs. But MDMA is I understand the most effective treatment for PTSD. It's been used in Paraguay and Uruguay for probably 15, 20 years. Are you able to use any of that in Colorado now?
This is where we need Chris Lindley. Who knows the law better than I do? I do think MDMA is one of the substances that is on a second tier with ibogaine. So right now it's only psilocybin, but it is one. But it's interesting. It's not a natural product, so I don't quite understand how that's going to work. But yes, so he was talking about an organization called MAPS, Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. They're now called LICOS. They've transitioned from being sort of this sort of nonprofit into a regular drug company.
It's like OpenAI.
Yeah, exactly. And they're trying to get approval from the FDA for MDMA as a treatment combined with therapy for post-traumatic stress disorder, and they got rebuffed this last August. There's a whole huge, if you follow the psychedelic world, it's a Gonzo-Magilla thing. But there's a lot of evidence, you're right, that when it's done in the context of therapy, that MDMA, which is not a classic psychedelic, but is we sometimes call it an empathogen, it has some of the same properties.
Typically, you don't get mystical experience, you don't get hallucinatory phenomena under NMDA typically.
Right, you get more of this sort of powerful sense of connection, love. You cut yourself a break.
The love molecule.
Yes, it's often called love molecule. Yes.
I'm curious your thoughts on spirit related to consciousness. And I've watched morphine be used towards the end of life, and it seemed to kind of help transfer to the next level or wherever the energy we all are goes. Have you studied the morphine and what happens to consciousness and what it may do and how the consciousness talk relates to spirit?
No, I can't tell you. I've never had such an experience. I don't know how morphium, because morphium typically is a sedative agent, right? It'll sedate you.
Yeah.
So it'll typically make you, the pain go away, but also your arousal level becomes very low. And so you're not really conscious. Very often you're only very dimly aware. In fact, there's a phenomena that's called terminal lucidity, which used to be very common in the world before we invented sedative agent, and used to be very common if you read literature of 17th, 18th, 19th century, or people died, where people with a long-term disease would sort of wake up and suddenly became their regular selves again, and they remembered things, and then an hour or two later they would die. This is a phenomenon that's now being studied by science. But that only occurs if you withdraw morphium and other sedatives.
Yeah.
That's a perfect segue into what I was going to ask. What's your experience with or thoughts about the use of psilocybin for terminal illness?
Yeah, I'll talk about that. So I think at the end of the day, psychedelics are going to be especially effective for people that are struggling with a particular issue that psychedelic experience can often address. So I think that, the data that it works for depression now is larger, and it's been done in more of an FDA, very rigorous, when we do these FDA trials, it costs millions of dollars, but there are a number of smaller academic studies that suggest that it's unbelievably effective for that. Like the first study that really launched this field by Roland Griffiths, they took 60 people that were clinically anxious and depressed, not because they'd been depressed forever, but because they were 60 years old and they were dying of cancer, right?
Stage 4 cancer.
Yeah, really, people that were, and these people were, but they were almost all depressed and anxious because they were terrified of death, terrified of their disease. 6 months after a single treatment, about 75% of them were completely remitted, no other treatments. It just went away. And when
they still died.
They died, yes.
They still died, but they totally lost. In fact, they appreciate, if you read Michael Pollan's book, Transcendence, right, he talks about that. Some of them, they radiated this feeling where even the doctors and the nurses that treated them were also transformed, because they just felt, okay, I only have 6 more months to live, so now I really need to live because life is so wonderful.
And so USONA Institute, which is the nonprofit that I serve as the director of clinical and translational research, it's a nonprofit drug company, which is weird, By the way, they're supplying the psilocybin for the studies here, so we're very grateful to them. They were started by a guy named Bill Linton, who was a wealthy guy who developed this big biotech company. He had a neighbor, a woman who was, in her 60s, I think, and she was dying of cancer, and she was so depressed and so anxious and so upset that it was horrible, and it was affecting her family. And so the family came and said, Bill, can you do something to help her? And so we started looking around, and he heard about this study of psilocybin at Johns Hopkins for people who were dying of cancer. And he flew over in his private jet, and the researcher was not used to people flying over in a private jet, and he said, boy, I'd sure like her to get in that study, and I'm a philanthropist. And so she got into the study. Surprise, surprise. And she had a treatment, and it totally transformed her. She went back home, and she had this radiating thing, and it all came back together for her, and she died 4 months later. But she died with a smile on her face, and Bill was like, I want to spend the rest of my life trying to make this a reality for people because it's just astounding. So this is one of the places where I think the most promise lies. The FDA has not been willing to this point to let you get an indication for that.
Because end of life is not a clinical
It's not a clinical thing,
condition.
right, yes. So basically what they would say is, if you're depressed and you're dying, it's no different than if you're depressed and your girlfriend left you. We're obligated to make it available to the widest group of people. We don't recognize a difference. There is a difference, but they don't recognize it. So, if it works in cancer people that are depressed, you have to then study everybody. And that's how the field began to study everybody, actually. But I am utterly convinced, as are many other people, that actually people struggling with death is probably one of the top indications for these things.
Have you had an experience where you were under the effect of this substance, and instead of you trying to reach or connect with some kind of energy or something, some energy tried to connect with you?
I mean, many people, particularly on ayahuasca, if you go to the Sante Daime ceremony, they talk about Sante Daime like a living presence. They call it the plant or daime, or daime is just Portuguese for to give. And yes, I haven't, but I don't believe so much in that, which is probably why I didn't have this experience. But many people report that they have these experiences of other beings, spirits or whatever they are, reaching out to them.
Yeah.
So your beliefs count for your experiences?
Well, my experience is unique, different from other. Look, at the end of the day, I'm a very rational person, and I try. So when I had this mystical experience, it's depicted there. Well, was it
the little
depicted
dot
there?
Yeah.
No, not the death. When I had that wasn't a mystical. That was a near death, which for me was different. When I experienced sort of this. The mind, what Huxley in his book, The Doors of Perception, called the mind at large, I try to sort of, it shifted the plates, the tectonic plates that make up what I believe to be true about the universe. And I grew up and I spent an entire time as a scientist studying what's physical. But so I still try to understand rational, how can I, because reason is ultimately the only thing that makes us different from other animals. We have reason. We can think about not just in irrational ways. We can use reason to figure things out. So for me, the challenge is, how can I integrate my experiences with reason? And for me, the most reasonable view is that ultimately what truly exists is just mental. It's just, it's a class of philosophical school called idealism. Ultimately what exists is just mental. And we partake for a brief moment of this own egoic consciousness, and on a certain condition, like on a mystical experience, you can lose your own egoic consciousness and you can somehow access this mind at large. But when I die, there's no doubt in my mind, when I die, Christof dies, permanent, that's it, Christof is gone. Okay, just like when you look at it here, I saw today where there's this beautiful river here, right, that runs past it, you can see that these little eddies, and you can observe some eddies stay there for 10 minutes or 20 minutes. And you can see 2 or 3 eddies, and they all have their own identity. But ultimately, sooner or later, a wave is going to come, or something's going to come, and this entity, these eddies, these whirlpools, will dissolve. Where do they go? Well, they go back and part of the larger river again. And so that's how I think about it. Christof we all will die at some point and will disappear. My memories will be gone. I'm not going to a new life, I think. But I'll become part of where I came from, where I was before I was born. This larger cosmic consciousness.
Last question.
My question is two-part. First of all, have you found that psychedelics would have any effect on people who are experiencing dementia or of any sort?
Yeah.
And that's the first question.
Okay.
My second question would be, in this day and age where AI has become so prevalent, have you thought about how that might affect our understanding of consciousness?
I will answer the first one quickly. They've done a small study in dementia. It didn't really work, but by the time you're demented, your brain's pretty fried up, right? But there's some intriguing evidence in animal models that they may actually have benefits for people in the very beginning processes when they're beginning to have cognitive problems. You come talk to me afterwards, I'll tell you, it's quite remarkable. There's a little bit of evidence. There's evidence in animals that they may extend life also, lifespan, which is trippy. I'm going to leave the AI to you.
Oh, wait, so you mean during so at the stage where you maybe have mild cognitive impairment?
It dissolves tau.
What?
Yeah. We haven't even talked about this yet. He and I have been talking nonstop for like 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, I don't know, a long time. But yeah, it's Stephen's wren. He's got the worms. But I'm going to let you talk about AI, because this is the...
Yeah, so the question everyone asks these days is ChatGPT conscious? And it's a legitimate question now. It used to be science fiction, but now it's a legitimate question, because you can ask it. Now, if they have the guardrails on, like on Google, what's it called, Gemini, it'll tell you no, because it's pre-programmed to say that, no, I'm not conscious, I'm just a piece of software. If you go to some of the, like say Grok, the one by Elon Musk, it'll tell, of course I'm conscious, and it'll tell you in detail about its conscious experience. Why? Because it's like a vampire. It's feasted on humanity's collective writing. And of course, people write, they write about their conscious state, when they love or hate or dread or fear, etc. And so it regurgitates all of that. Now you can step back and ask, what would it take for any entity to be conscious? And that really is a very difficult question, particularly for things that are non-involved, that are non-organic and very different from us. So here, there are really two fundamental divisions in the field. So the majority of theories are so-called functionalist theories, okay, like computational functionalism. And they say consciousness has one or more functions. And once you replicate that function on a computer, yes, the computer will be conscious. So pick your favorite function of consciousness, planning or language or speaking or having a summary of events, whatever it is. If ChatGPT can do it, yes, then it's conscious. And the arguments are, well, is it conscious now, or do we have to wait, for 4.0 or 4.5? Right? So, but there the belief is consciousness is a function. Once you replicate the function, that's it. Nothing more is needed. And then there are others, like the one that I've worked on for my life, which is really Giulio Tononi, a colleague of ours in Madison, says, no, it's fundamentally different. It really has to do with the constitution, ultimately with the way the thing is put together. In principle, there's nothing supernatural about the human brain. So if you build a replica of the human brain in silicon, it could be conscious. But the way digital computers are built today, it's a very radical different architecture, computer architecture, phenomenal architecture, and it will never feel like anything to be ChatGPT. That doesn't mean it may not be possible that once, for example, we get to quantum computers, which have a very different architectures, or so-called neuromorphic computers that are computers built, constructed at the level of the silicon where the metal hits the road, that they may not be conscious. But digital computers like ChatGPT will never be conscious, although they claim, and they're very good at it, and they'll get better at it, and they'll take all of us in believing. Because we have this thing called attribution. Right? Humans do it automatically. When you think, gosh, it's so clever, it knows all the answer, and it says, I feel, don't turn me off. How can we deny it? Well, don't trust it. It's a deep fake. Trust me. I'm a conscious being.
All right, we'll stop on that. Thank you, Dr. Koch.
Before we close out, keep it going for Dr. Chuck Raison and Dr. Christof Koch. Thank you both so much.